Welcome to the third video. We've gone through pre-colonial history, the phases of early colonialism and early industrial, and now we're into the coastal development phase. At this point, there was a little more industry, and quite a few more people in New Zealand after the turn of the 20th century, and steam trawlers were brought to New Zealand. So with the advent of steam trawlers, you had the ability to pull a much bigger net. Rather than just relying on wind, you could have a screw turning with an engine, and that large, powerful propeller could mean the expansion of nets to much bigger sizes. So New Zealand government thought, the government officials thought, well, we've got this big resource and we haven't really exploited it in terms of selling fish overseas. Let's actually start trying to expand the fishery and see what the resources are out there. So they bought this boat called the SS Dodo, and this was the first government-owned fishing boat, and it went all around the entire coast of New Zealand, doing exploratory trawls and trying to find out what rich fishing areas there were with the new advent of steam trawling. And so rather than those little boatloads that we saw before, we wind up having scenes like this. So you can see that going from a small shore-based fishery to a larger fisheries like this, you can see that the efficiency of the gear is starting to get pretty good. But if you look at these fish, you can also see that they're all quite large fish. You'll notice that there are things like hapaca within that those samples, as well as some of the deeper water species. But wouldn't have been uncommon to get a load of hapaca in a trawl net off of Papua 150 years ago. Okay. In this phase, long lines were also introduced. Danish seining, which we'll go over in our commercial fisheries methods. Rock lobster potting on an industrial scale. Mary had been doing it for quite a long time. And due to these new techniques, some areas the catches started to drop drastically. And this was the first phase, even in Europe, where people started to think that fisheries may not be completely inexhaustible. Before the advent of the steam trawler and industrial scale fishing, people thought that fish laid so many eggs that no matter how many you took, they could replace themselves very quickly. But they didn't realize how susceptible to mortality the young fish were. And with that realization that you could deplete a fishery, the science of fisheries management began. After the end of this expansion phase, the government, noticing that catches were depleted in certain areas, began the intervention phase. 1937, Sea Fisheries Investigation Committee was appointed to inquire into the fishery after certain areas became very depleted, and they decided that they needed to limit fishing effort, and so this Marine Department started regulating how many fishing licenses they were going to allow. So people who already were fishing were allowed licenses, but they sold very few over the next, from the 1930s to the 1963. And so therefore the rapid development of the fishery ceased. There were also seasonal fishing closures, fishing restrictions were introduced, very few more boats came into the fleet. But the problem was that this is during and after the World War II. And after World War II, there were lots and lots of boats that had been used to transport materials around the world for the war effort, which were able to travel long distances on the open seas. And there were lots of hungry people in Europe and Japan and China that had been where war had ravaged the infrastructure. And so many of these boats were converted to fisheries vessels. And so not only did those few vessels that New Zealand had start to get bigger, stay at sea longer, and steam greater distances, but also Japanese fishing vessels were first witnessed along the deeper offshore waters from 1959, and that just grew and grew. Of the intervention phase, that was the end of the intervention phase, and the beginning of the development phase. So the development phase, 63 to 78, was the big reversal, and the emphasis now is full development of the fishery and exports. So they wanted to expand the fleet to allow the maximum catch. Okay, so this is the beginning of maximum sustainable yield. So fishing licenses, rather than fishing licenses, they became fishing permits. Pretty much anybody could get a fishing permit, and so many more people started buying fishing licenses, and export markets opened up. And as the markets and demand grew, so did the fishing fleet. So in 1965, Japanese alleged infringements led government to, so they were coming in closer than 3 miles. So the government established a 9-mile fishing zone. All right, Japan, Korea, Taiwan continued to fish for tunas and billfish in the southern Pacific Ocean, so they were fishing out pelagically. But we just said, all right, we're going to say that you can't fish within 9 miles of the coast. Now that's really still not very far. Here are some instances of foreign vessels coming to New Zealand waters. I'll let you read those in your own time if you stop the video. And so since these foreign vessels were in direct competition with New Zealand's smaller vessels, we had very small vessels, most of them under 9 meters. This was considered to be a problem, and it was considered to be a problem in other parts of the world. We weren't the only ones where other nations were fishing in waters that were considered to be sovereign, a little bit too close for comfort. And in 1977, the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone was declared, and that was the end of the development phase. Also in that time, of course, while the government was encouraging development, they made it incentives such as low interest loans and for vessel construction and for purchase, and they helped with developing these export markets. So they subsidized marketing trips and the like. So they also spent $50 million in catching and processing facilities over a 5-year period from 1975. So that is stuff like that is essentially taxpayer dollars going to companies like Sanford's. Sealords wasn't established at that point yet, but other companies that to help them process and catch fish and send it overseas to encourage an export market.